lesson in the book of Isaiah. I think I've talked to two different people recently whose churches or preachers have just gone through the book of Isaiah. We might get through the whole chapter. We'll see how quick this goes. Isaiah chapter number 2. Now, the first chapter began with the statement, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, and then it gives a reference to the kings that he prophesied, under whose reigns he prophesied. So you have a timetable that you can assign to the book. But then the second chapter begins nearly the same way. It says, the word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now, again, I've already mentioned this, but some folks think that, and some scholars, and especially some of the Jewish scholars, I think, have it in their minds that Isaiah's prophecy in some ways is clearer and slightly different than the prophecies of some of the other prophets in the Old Testament in the manner in which it was delivered. It is a vision that's referred to. It's not simply hearing the word of God or relaying what the Lord says to him. And even here it says the word that Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. So it kind of implies that there was a vision here as well. Not just an audible revelation from the Lord, but a vision again, which is such as is described in the first chapter. This would be maybe a vision that would come, or a prophecy that's delivered to him after the other. Of course, some folks think that maybe even if you go to chapter number 6, it might be the actual beginning of the prophecy of Isaiah, as far as in a chronological sense. And some of these other chapters might be a preface to, and maybe might have even been delivered after the prophecy that's given to us in chapter number 6. And some folks think that the first 5 chapters are just a preface that's put here, and you can't really assign a sequence to the actual prophecies. But however you want to look at it, this apparently is, I think, another vision that Isaiah has, and again, it's concerning Judah and Jerusalem. We don't know exactly the timetable, because in the first chapter he refers to all these kings. We don't even know exactly when that is, when that first chapter was delivered, which king was actually on the throne. We do know in chapter number 6, because he even says in the year that King Uzziah died. But anyway, these are all important. These are all important words. This is the word of the Lord that's given to the children of Israel, particularly Judah and Jerusalem, and that is God speaking to them through Isaiah. Chapter 2 is interesting, because I think as you read through here, and I've already mentioned this to you, and I think you'll see this as we go through the other chapters as well. Isaiah prophesies a lot of the millennial reign, and I think that's what chapter number 2 is speaking of. It's speaking of the things that take place in the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord can be a bit vague, again, if you try to assign a certain literal day or a certain literal year or even time period in the history of man. But the way I look at it is the day of the Lord it usually pertains to the time that the Lord would come, the time that the Lord would return. In a sense, it's the day of man now, but it will be the day of the Lord when he comes to set up his throne, when he comes to judge men, when he comes to rescue his people. Then the will of God, which is the spoken will of God, the revealed will of God, which men will rebel against in this day and time. During the day of the Lord, they will not. The Lord will impose his ways and his will upon men, and you can see that, I think, in the second chapter. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. So this is speaking of the end times. It says in the last days. So if you want to try to figure out when this took place, I don't think you can really find an occasion in the history of Israel or Judah when this has been fulfilled up till now. So I think the time still awaits us. that the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. You can see times and periods when the kings of Judah and Israel were very powerful, but when Isaiah is delivering this, the power and the fame, the prestige of the kings of Judah and Israel has waned. Now, of course, King Josiah would come along, and King Hezekiah was very powerful and influential as well, but it isn't to the level as what seems to be described here in this second chapter. And then if you keep on reading, it said, and many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Okay, so a lot of even a lot of Baptist scholars that you would read after immediately begin to apply the things that are being spoken of here to the Gentiles. And they say, so they're taking a spiritual Judah, a spiritual Jerusalem, and they say the mountain of the Lord's house will be established. They take that, go so far as to say that's a reference to the church, and all nations shall flow into it. And I can see how that could be applied that way, and maybe there is a sort of a fulfillment in that fashion as well, because all nations, the gospel goes forth. Yes, Brother Jerry.
Schofield's got on the mountain, two footnote that the kingdom. It's a kingdom which goes along.
Yeah. So they would say either the kingdom of God, like as it exists now, with the Gentiles included. Yeah. And you can see that. I mean, you can see that there would be a fulfillment in that. To some degree. I mean, it is all of the nations of the earth, like the Lord told us to take the gospel and preach it to every creature, go ye into all the world, and so the church has done that, and so souls are saved, trusting in the Christ all around the world, and it did begin in Judah and Jerusalem. So you can say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways. And it kind of began in Judah and Jerusalem, like they referred to in the first verse. But it's a task, a role that the church fulfills now, and not the children of Israel. And the duty they had to proclaim the God of Jacob, you see there in verse number 3, has been, in this age, in our age, has been granted unto the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. But I still think that the fullest fulfillment is going to be during the millennial reign, when the Lord sets up his when he rules over the world and sets up his literal, physical, earthly kingdom. You can see it fulfilled in some measure in the spiritual kingdom, but I think you'll see it fulfilled in its fullest sense during the millennial reign. It says in verse 4, and he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people. We haven't seen any of this take place yet. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. I was reading what one commentator had to say, and he said that this is a mandated or an imposed peace. It's not that men just want to be peaceful now, but the Lord is now judging. It says, and he shall judge among the nations. He's going to rule, and like in that song that we were practicing there before church, he's going to rule with his rod of iron. And so there won't be any countries making war against each other, because he won't permit it. He won't allow it. So that would only occur, I think, during the millennial reign, because at the end of the millennial reign, when Satan is released from his 1,000 years of bondage, he's going to go out and deceive the nations, and there will be war again after that. And again, you can see it maybe a sort of a spiritual sense here, again, that the people of God, instead of waging war physically, even now, ours is a message of peace. Ours is a message of repentance and forgiveness, and we don't go out and wage physical war like other religions do. So maybe you could see a sense of that being fulfilled even in this day and age. But I think what it's mainly referring to is the time to come, which has not yet arrived, when the Lord's going to set up his throne here on the earth. If you go over to Micah, chapter number 4, I think this is kind of interesting. Micah prophesied during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. The period of his ministry is overlapped by that of Isaiah. They preached and prophesied at the same time. It says, and look how similar this is. Some folks think that Micah even read what Isaiah preached and repeated it. You know, I don't believe that, but the Lord speaks through Micah the same words that he speaks through Isaiah. It says in Micah chapter 4, verse 1, "But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it." See how similar it is to what we just read? "And many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn more any more." And so you can see how similar that is to what we just read. Again, I think this is what the Jews were looking for. When they read all these prophecies, and when they heard these prophecies, and in the future generations, as they anticipated the coming of the Christ, as they read these prophecies, they expected a literal physical kingdom to be set up that would be wherein the Lord would reign and peace would be. Peace would rule, and the Lord would judge nations, and he would mandate peace and elevate Judah and Jerusalem to the place where they would be ruling the world, and they would set up his kingdom. That's what they were looking for, and that's what they anticipated when Jesus Christ came the first time. But that he came then in a sense, to set up his spiritual kingdom. You could say that there was already, in a sense, those that were true Israel served him in spirit and in truth even up till this time. But you can call it the church age, however you want to look at it. But it is a kingdom that's not mortal or physical in its dimensions, or in the manner in which it's set up here on the earth. It's a spiritual kingdom, but he will set it up in a physical fashion one day. He says in verse number 5, "O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord." Now that seems like that's kind of inserted here. Maybe it's almost like a plea delivered to the children of Israel. Like I said, a lot of the Baptist theologians think that verses 1 through 4 may refer to the Lord turning from Judah and Jerusalem and turning to the Gentiles, and almost replacing the Jews with the Gentiles and those that are saved, all around the world. All the nations shall flow into it, so basically the promises that were granted to Judah and Jerusalem will then be transferred to the Gentiles. And they are for a period of time, but not forever. The Lord will return to his people, and his people will return to him. And this, in a sense, I think maybe is what Isaiah is saying here: "O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord." Either urging them to walk in the light of the Lord in anticipation of the things that are spoken of in verses 1 through 4, or urging them to walk in the light of the Lord because if the day of the Lord is upon us, we want to be included in it could be a warning that we would not be included in the things that are mentioned in verses 1 through 4. They might not be the ones that would go up to the house of the God of Jacob. They might not be the ones that would be taught of his ways and to walk in his paths if they turned away from the Lord. It says in verse 6, "Therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers." If you go to read John Gill's commentary, which I read pretty regular, he's got an interesting take on the whole chapter, which again is probably pretty similar to a lot of other historic Baptists. But I think again they're missing the point, at least as far as I see it, that the Lord loves his people Jacob, and if he abandons them, it's only for a period of time. It's not forever. And so, but what John Gill and some of the others think is that now these things when Jacob's referred to here, it is a reference to those who now occupy the place that Jacob used to occupy. So this would be to the Gentiles and the others that take upon them the name of the Lord, and they are now the house of Jacob. And so he applies this to the end times and shows how that even in the end times there's going to be some, and he begins then to compare Christianity to it begins to refer to Christianity and refers to the heresy and to the wickedness that inhabits Christianity. He'll even go so far as to paint a picture here where you can see the Antichrist and the others that are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers, and just how those that took the place of the Jews have now lost their favor with the Lord. But I just prefer to take it as literally as possible. And the house of Jacob, I think, is a reference to the children of Israel. And when the Lord returns, remember we're talking about in the last days, it says in verse number 2, I think the last days are upon us. And what is the state of the house of Israel now? And Jacob. They don't walk in the light of the Lord, like it's mentioned in verse number 5, so that's why we implore them to do so. They have forsaken, therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob. They've forsaken the Lord, so in a sense the Lord has forsaken them for now. But we know that they will return to him during the time of Jacob's trouble. But it said, because they be replenished from the east and are soothsayers. I don't know entirely what that's, there's different ideas on what's being referred to here, but they look to their help, and they look for their help and for their pleasures in this life. They look to men. They're soothsayers like the Philistines. They please themselves and the children of strangers. In other words, the Lord isn't their pleasure now, and they don't even the house of Jacob today. And again, I think that the end times are upon us. I think the return of the Lord could be at any moment. The house of Jacob today doesn't even acknowledge Jesus as the Christ. Their land also is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Their land is also full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. They trust in men, they trust in their riches. They look to they look to the pleasures of this world. It says their land also is full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. What they've forsaken the God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Bible, and they've made idols and they've worshipped them. Maybe you could see there might even be, if you studied this enough, there could even be maybe in this description here in verses 5 through 9, you might even have a progressive description of the depths to which Jacob has fallen. They forsook the Lord, so the Lord forsook them. They began to trust in men and the powers of others rather than trusting in the Lord. And then they got caught up in silver and gold and the pursuit of treasures and power and fame in the earth. And then they even went so far as to fall prey to idolatry. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. And the mean man boweth down, and the great man humbleth himself. Therefore forgive them not. That's an interesting statement inserted there at the end. When you read in the prophecies, and you realize this is a prophecy that comes from the Lord, spoken by Isaiah to the people. Sometimes you sit here trying to figure out, now, is this the Lord speaking or is this Isaiah speaking? Or is this the Isaiah speaking in the third person of what other people would say? Therefore forgive them not. Maybe that's what some would say in the day of the Lord. Don't forgive these people because look at what they've done. Or it could be Isaiah, saying, we even mentioned this before church, talking about, Lord, judge them based upon what they've done. But again, that could be whoever's saying it, even if it is, the Lord speaking this through Isaiah. It's an indictment on the behavior of the house of the people of the house of Jacob, referred to in verse 6. Enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. Go over to Revelation chapter number 6. I wrote this down just because this is the first verse you think of when you read that. This is the day of the Lord. And during the time of the tribulation leading up to the millennial reign, it says in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15, and the kings of the earth and the great men and the rich men and the chief captains and the mighty men and every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? You know, a lot of people are looking forward to the day of the Lord, and really they ought not. They ought to be trembling in their shoes. The day of the Lord is going to include judgment against the wicked. Now, when I say that, I guess I should explain myself. You know, the people of the Lord should be looking forward to the day of the Lord, but some folks that somehow trust in their own works for their salvation, or they fooled themselves into thinking that they're good enough to please God were he to come today, actually look forward to the coming of the Lord, but it's going to be a day of judgment for the wicked. And there's going to be many that cry out to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Maybe even many of the Jews. Remember how the Jews cried out at the crucifixion of the Lord? They said, crucify him, and then they told Pilate, they said, his blood be on us and on our children. And I think they're kind of under that curse even to this day. Again, I fully believe the Lord will redeem his people and bring them back to him, but in the process many have died, and many still yet will die in rebellion to the Lord, and they'll cry out for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Now that's an idea or a thought that we need to carry with us no matter what particular event we're discussing, no matter what is the occasion of the prophecy given or the will of the Lord being accomplished on the earth, no matter what situation men might be in. It should be the aim that the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day, and whether Jacob is forsaken or whether Jacob is redeemed, whether the Gentiles are saved or whether they're left desolate and left to their own devices, the Lord will be exalted. That's the aim. So even in the salvation of souls, that the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. None of these folks that trusted in their silver and gold or their treasures or their lands that were full of idols that were given the glory that should have been God's, they were giving it to others, they're going to pay the price for that. And I suspect that we ought to keep that in mind too, even those of us that are saved. The aim is that the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. It's the day of the Lord. I already mentioned that we're kind of in the day of man now, and that the man is you can't say he's doing as he wants to, because the Lord still restrains, but he's permitted man many liberties, and he's long-suffering in allowing man to offend him over and over and over. But when the day of the Lord comes, all of that is going to cease. And so he's going to enforce his will. He's going to judge men, and so in some ways you could say that the day of the Lord describes the time when he asserts himself, but it also describes a time when the Lord alone will be glorified. Up till now, men are giving glory to others. When the day of the Lord comes in its fullest, only God will be exalted. And then it says, for the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon every one that is proud and lofty, and upon every one that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. There's some verses here that are a bit repetitive in these next several verses. When the day of the Lord of hosts comes, the proud and lofty are going to be brought down, because that would deny the Lord his glory. So they'll be brought down. They shall be brought low, and upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, all the things that men highly esteem, and the things that seem impressive or powerful, maybe even those things in this earth that we might glorify or exalt, these will be brought low in comparison to the glory of the Lord. And upon all the high mountains and upon all the hills that are lifted up. It's a tendency of men in the Middle East, and I suppose it's probably in other places too, when they worship their false gods and their deities, they like to go on top of the mountains. They like to somehow get closer to the stars and what they imagine, where they imagine their God is, and maybe they think, and the Jews did that. they corrupted the worship of the Lord by mixing with it the worship of idols. So they saw others that would worship under green trees, which were kind of a sign of fertility, and on tops of mountains. Their favorite places to worship were under green trees on top of mountains, if you look in the Old Testament. And they would do that, and they would go there to worship the Lord, is what they said. But their worship just became more and more corrupted, and soon they were just worshiping the false gods and using these mountains and the hills to worship their false gods. That could be what's referred to here. And he says, and upon every high tower and upon every fenced wall. But anyway, things that seem high, things that seem strong, and upon all the ships of Tarshish and upon all pleasant pictures. So these will all be brought low. The day of the Lord shall be upon all of these. He alone will be glorified even in the presence of all these. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. That's very similar to verse 11 when he said, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Again, it's the day of the Lord. It's a day that will glorify him, and men won't be exalted, men won't be lifted up. And this is what we anticipate. Now again, you could say, and some will say that this is a prediction that the Lord will turn from the Jews, and he'll, and he's going to deal with now the Gentiles and establish the spiritual kingdom. And in some, you can see that now during the age of grace, you might say, we are no longer under the law in the sense that we seek to answer it and maybe follow in the footsteps of the Jews and seek to fulfill the law and gain salvation through obedience to the law, and count on our works for our righteousness. And you might say, well, so that the loftiness of man is bowed down. We live in the age of grace when men depend upon the grace of God for salvation, and I can see that. I mean, I can see how you might say that that's what's being referred to here in some sense, that now in the age of grace and in the time when the Lord has set up his spiritual kingdom, and especially as we think about the church, things are different. And the worship of the idols of men's hands, or the worship of the works of men, and trusting in those works, that's come to an end. This is the day of the Lord, and we trust in the Lord. But I still think, again, the primary fulfillment and the references to when the Lord will come to set up his earthly kingdom. It says in verse 18, and the idols he shall utterly abolish. Not that men don't still want to worship the idols. He's going to put a stop to it. He's going to actively assert his will and prohibit men from worshiping idols. And this is going to go on for 1,000 years. This is impressive when you think about it, and it's something that kind of is kind of it's interesting, but it's also very pleasing to us to think about these things. That for 1,000 years, the Lord's going to judge among the nations. He's going to rebuke many people. He's going to put an end to war. He's going to put an end to idolatry. He's going to put an end to the haughtiness and the high looks of men, and they're going to just fear the Lord, and they're going to, many will be saved, I think, but they won't be. It's not like now, in our day and time, where you have to be tolerant of other people's beliefs. The Lord won't be tolerant of other people's beliefs. We're told that this is an age, in our nation, that this is a day of diversity and tolerance. And I understand that that's a good thing in the way that our nation was set up, that you have men and women of different beliefs that coexist and live together. But the underlying tenets of what they believed was in the God of Christianity. A God that created men and that expected men to obey his word. And there was that fear of God even in the beginning. Baptists didn't force Methodists to become Baptists, and Catholics didn't lord it over the Baptists or anything like that. They tolerated these others as long as they didn't break any laws, if you want to look at it that way. But now what we're being taught is that we have to tolerate men's evil beliefs and their wicked pastimes, and all that. And no matter what their opinion is, we have to let them go their own way. It won't be like that during the millennial reign. The Lord's not going to allow sodomites to run rampant. There won't be any nation on the face of the earth that will be able to legalize abortion. He's going to enforce his law, and the Lord alone he will be the only God that men will be allowed to publicly refer to, I think. Now, it's not all men will be saved. Men will still be rebels. I understand that, but he's going to enforce this rule and his will upon them. And the reason we know that not all men will be saved is because at the end of the millennial reign, the devil will go out and deceive the nations, and I think that will be the unsaved folks that he'll gather together to fight against the Lord in the last battle. So there have to be some unsaved folks that would live during that millennial reign in order for the devil to go out and deceive them. But I think you can also see it here. There's going to be some that would want to worship idols, but he shall utterly abolish. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. He's going to be a God that men will fear. And this could be even speaking of the times that would lead up to the millennial reign as well. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats. I'd forgotten about that verse when I read that earlier. That's an interesting verse as a reference to moles and to the bats. Some people think that might have some reference to the fact that, we think of moles and bats, we think of blind, but they're both blind. They don't see very well. And that's how men are. And men are afflicted with blindness, just like moles and bats might be in the daylight. And these are the ones that worship the idols of silver and the idols of gold. But I think it just goes along with the fact that he refers to they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth, and that's where the men will cast their idols of silver and their idols of gold. They'll take them into secret places, in the dark places, and maybe in the caves or underground, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the tops of the ragged rocks for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. There isn't any place men can go to hide from the Lord. There isn't any place that we can go to escape his notice. Yet men futilely try to do that. And maybe based upon the fact that God has been so long-suffering, maybe men think we've got away with it so far. Let's just go a little bit further. We've got away with our sin for so long. Let's just sin a little bit more. But when the day of the Lord comes, the day of man will be at an end as far as us doing as we please and accomplishing our will, even when it defies the Lord. He's going to judge. He's going to impose his will. So cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of? Over in the book of James, it says in chapter 4, in verse number 14, it says, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow, then he says, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. These are the folks that think to thwart God, to resist him, to overcome him, to defy his will. And you could take this another direction as well. The Lord breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. So even the breath of life that men have comes from God, and we think somehow that we can resist him when he judges the earth, or that we can deny him, or that we could worship false gods or idols, which the Jews have done and are doing even now, denying that Jesus is the Christ. But the Lord is, that verse kind of brings the chapter to a close by just reminding us that the Lord is, he's great, he's strong, and that men are puny and helpless before such a God. All right, I'm going to stop right there.